We're here today to discuss the 2024 four-episode docu-series that purports to expose the toxic culture and personal violations alleged to have occurred behind the scenes of the most iconic Nickelodeon children's shows of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The series just dropped on the ID channel and it's called Quiet on Set: The Dark Side of Kids TV.
The series is comprised of interviews with ex-Nickelodeon child stars, ex-Nickelodeon employees, and investigative journalists. This was a bombshell documentary that has erupted in scandal for the kids' TV industry. But is the expose what it claims to be, or simply a hit piece on somebody being made the fall guy? Well, we're here to investigate the investigation and let you know whether this docuseries is all that people claim.
I'm Heit.
And I'm Cheri.
And you've discovered Axiom Amnesia.
A lot of you requested that we cover this film, and I can't wait for us to talk about it. But first, we want to thank all of the supporters who helped to make this video possible. If you want your name to appear alongside these contributors, make a one-time donation via Cash App or click the thanks button on this video, or you can head on over to patreon.com/axiomamnesia or become a channel member by clicking the join button to enjoy all of the benefits of becoming a monthly subscriber. So we had to come and cover this docuseries, partially because everybody's talking about it, and I am hearing things that aren't exactly the way that I would interpret what I saw on film in these 4 long episodes that we watched.
Leading up to this, I seen a whole bunch of stuff on social media. You know, I seen articles of what Dan Schneider was saying, and there was these allegations and stuff going on in Nickelodeon. People were like, oh my God, all of this stuff at Nickelodeon is so terrible. I've been telling y'all, and you know, that sort of thing. And then you had people like, they came with all the receipts, and you know, so like, hey, let's go watch this thing and see what's going on.
Let's give it a chance. So that you don't have to actually watch this 4-part series, although I do encourage it being a waste of time anyway, that you do for yourself. Don't just take our word for it. If you really want to know and be able to speak definitively on what happened in it, you should actually watch it yourself. But here's the basics of what happened. So there's this guy, Dan Schneider, who was an actor from the TV show Head of the Class, which was out in the 80s. I remember that TV show when I was a kid, and it starred him and Robin Givens and some other folks who later became more famous. So anyway, he was on this show, and then he has this rebirth over at Nickelodeon as a writer on their children's shows, right? And then he eventually is the person who creates some TV shows and stuff like that. So the accusation that is basically leveled against him is that, you know, the work culture there when he was in charge, because, you know, he got pretty big at Nickelodeon, was a toxic work culture. So in the beginning, the whole first episode is dedicated to just kind of building up the dun 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 dun, you know, and it's the end of the episode by the time we get a clue as to what they're saying about Dan Schneider. So the bulk of the bad things, other than just innuendo, are being said by 2 women writers who wrote for the show, and they basically accused him of sexism because, you know, he said things like, oh, women aren't funny and whatever, and, you know, it just kind of gave them a harder time. The more egregious thing that he did would be asking women for body rubs, like back rubs, and to give him massages in the workplace. I mean, clearly, it was never acceptable to do that. And especially in the 2024 time frame, you know, nobody should be doing this kind of thing on the job now. Like, everybody's aware, you know, back then maybe folks weren't, you know, a lot of things happened to women back then that should never have happened. But anyway, so you have these 2 women who talk about his sexism, and that's what they're pointing at him for. And they even, one of them even, you know, had a lawsuit because basically they both, well, one of them was pushed out and whatever when some changes were made and stuff like that. And the other one went on to do some other stuff later. So they were just talking about this kind of workplace that was quite hostile toward women. They also talked about the way the children were treated and how Dan must have been like this weird guy because he had the children set up in these weird positions and would make jokes. It seemed like he had a foot fetish. He'd have the, tween girls having stuff splashed on their face in ways that would almost look like for lack of a better word, money shot that you might see in something for adults, right? So that's really kind of the accusations that they leveled. But they admit that they were in the writer's room. They were aware of the stuff that was going on as far as that is concerned, right?
So at the beginning, you said that it's a waste of time. So why do you think it's a waste of time?
Because it takes forever to get to the point, and it's 4 episodes, and it should be condensed down.
Yeah.
So by kind of giving you the like you could almost skip episode 1 with the basic exception. It's just like you get a nugget here, a nugget there, and in between that you get a lot of innuendo and fluff, right?
Yeah. So to summarize, the implications and everything that people were saying on social media is that Dan Schneider was this pedo, basically, and he was doing all this stuff, right? So then we get into this docu-series, and we see that there were writers who were making the children in the episodes and in the shows do and say these things, and they tried to put it all on Dan Schneider, like, it's him, he's a mastermind, when it was a whole bunch of people, all of the writers, all of the adults in the room, the cameramen, the grips, or whoever was on set, and especially the writers and the costume designers, because part of it was, look at these costumes. And they kind of just got off scot-free, the people who weren't Dan Schneider, right?
Right. They all like pointed the finger at Dan Schneider when they were in the room. And then the way that, like you said, this docuseries is positioned is that Dan Schneider is the target. Dan Schneider is the one who was the one doing things to children. Now, there were people who did do things to these children, but none of the accusations leveled in this particular documentary talk about the violations, the actual, violations of a sexual nature, right? And
you mean with Dan?
With Dan, right? And actually, we don't have evidence that there was any, right? With Dan, the accusation is that he was a sexist and he had a toxic work environment and he was a weirdo who did suggestive things, right, on camera that also apparently were quite hilarious to children. Okay. But there were no accusations directed at him. It actually was people who worked on the show, right? At least 2 people who worked on these shows who did things to these children, but their name is like never even mentioned in the lead up. So here you go into this thinking it's all Dan Schneider. And that's where we get this notion that, is this a hit piece or, what is this? Because
what they did, it takes until like the 3rd episode until we get to what actually happened. I believe in the 2nd episode, you get, okay, there was this guy who was doing something, right? And he was, like a cameraman and stuff. And you know how you get to move around in these organizations. And he was actually doing things. One mother knew about it because he sent her daughter an inappropriate picture, but she didn't contact the authorities or anything. And then he ended up getting arrested. Right.
So and that guy, he wasn't a cameraman. He was like the guy who ushers the kid from place to place on the set. Like he go, oh, it's your turn, or we're filming you. And, you'd see him in the background sometimes. That's that guy. So that's the first guy that they talk about. And then there's another guy who is like a coach, like basically some type of acting speech coach. Right. That guy is related to the most high profile situation here, where the one of the child actors, Drake Bell, he comes on. So this is really the big reveal, right? Where he comes on and he says that this acting coach, did something to him. So just to be clear, Jason Michael Handy was the production assistant who messed with and sent that inappropriate text and, was messing with folks on the set, right? The children. And then Drake Bell the one who did things to him was Brian Peck, right? And Brian Peck was a speech coach, a dialogue coach.
Yeah. So I think there's supposed to be this implication that all this bad stuff was going on at Nickelodeon, right? So the lead up to it would be that, yo, look at all this stuff that's going on in Nickelodeon. And I think it's probably easier to all point at one person, right? Because I'm not going to say it's all acceptable what Dan Schneider was doing, right? Because he's in the writer room at the time and he's interacting with his employees, basically explicitly sexually harassing them and everything, right? And then you got all the workers. How far does that extend, right? If I'm a writer and I'm going to write this dialogue because we're talking about over a decade where I'm going to start writing this dialogue and be laughing about these jokes and everything. At what point is it enough to say enough? I'm not doing this anymore, right? So we get these situations where, we just point at one person when you say it come from the top and he creates the toxic culture or this culture of abuse, then the people in it too are involved.
They're complicit.
Yeah.
And even some of the parents, writers, like in different levels of of being responsible for what happened to these children. Because see, you can't paint it the same way when you are a grown adult woman. Not that what happened to you wasn't wrong, but as a writer, you're in there talking about how terrible he was and what the pressure that Dan Schneider had on you as a female writer, and you're still writing these jokes or watching him do these things. It's like
over and over and over again,
and you want it so bad. Yes, what he did to you was wrong, but you were also an adult. You also could have pulled the trigger, and you did later, right, of suing and all of these things to try to get your remedy. But what about the children? You knew or you felt that certain things were inappropriate. Now, to be clear, these writers didn't necessarily know about the actual offenders that had been hired by Nickelodeon that were in there doing stuff. I'm talking about you were aware of what Dan Schneider.
Of the culture. If it's a culture of we're creating shows and making kids do these sexualized jokes and you're a part of it and laughing, then you advance this.
Yeah, then one of the accusations by the child stars on there was that they had a TV show where they would have to do, it was basically like teen or tween Fear Factor, if you remember that show from back in the day, where they make you do gross stuff and whatever. There was one kid who had to be covered in peanut butter and have dogs lick it off of him, and he was just like saying, and you see him say it in the tape, I don't like this. I don't want this to go on, right? But the fact that these children as child stars were exploited is absolutely terrible. It's wrong. It's egregious. However, that is a different thing than saying that they were, they had these sexual things go on.
It was
right?
Brian Hearn. And
Brian Hearn. Okay.
It was all kind of racist stuff as well that was going on, right? That everybody was a part of and then on the jokes. So, yeah, you had that part of the culture. But yeah, that is a totally different thing. But we do get to Drake Bell making an allegation and it leading to the arrest of Brian Peck. So this happened, but the way he told that story, you got to go and watch it for yourself. But it's kind of crazy. And I think it's just kind of like by chance that he actually did say something, right? Because one of the things was his girlfriend's mother kind of figured it out first, but she didn't go to the authorities, right? So it took him actually coming out to someone else before it's made its way to the authorities, and there was an arrest of Brian Peck. And then one of the things they said was, okay, this happened. So then they gathered all the kids together or some kids together and asked them, oh, is there anything y'all need to tell us, basically, right?
In front of each other. The lawyers are asking
in front of everybody, yeah.
And when nobody speaks up, they're like, all right.
They're like, all right, checklist.
We've done our investigation.
Yeah.
Nothing's going on. Yeah.
That's not Dan Schneider, right? Even though it's probably in his best interest, or you know what I'm saying?
To have asked. That's the legal team, right? So it's the whole of Nickelodeon, because at the end of the day, by the time these things were really coming out, they were making a whole bunch of money from these shows and these kids who were on the show. I mean, we're talking about people who would later become big and people who became big back then, like Amanda Bynes.
Then with Drake Bell, what he said was, Nickelodeon done this, and he was asked about like how did the people at Nickelodeon actually respond, right? And he said only one who really showed up for him basically was Dan Schneider. Right, he the only one who looked out for him because Dan Schneider actually called him because he seen the signs, right? That okay, these people, this grown man is hanging out with this kid a lot. They're spending a lot of time together, and he called him and basically asked him, "Was it you?" And he admitted it, and they had a little conversation about that, and he felt comfortable to say that Dan Schneider was the only one who really kind of looked out for him.
And although it wasn't clear, they were implying that earlier in the series that Dan Schneider was being too close to some of the the girl kid stars, right? He was fully clothed in a hot tub with Amanda Bynes doing this weird sort of interview thing. And then, of course, just how he would put his, he was in pictures with them and he was just around. And I'm certainly, to be absolutely clear, not making any excuse for whatever his behavior was. But the docuseries falls flat on actually saying or implicating him in things beyond the accused sexism and just toxic exploitative type of environment and the suggestive sexual type of jokes that might have been a bit much for the tween audience.
But to summarize, it was Brian Peck, Jason Michael Handy, right? Mm-hmm. Who actually done something from what they showed in the documentary or the docu-series. And Dan Schneider led shows and he led, some writer rooms and stuff. And there were a host of writers and everybody else who were involved in making sexualized jokes using kids, right?
Right.
And Dan Schneider kind of may have done things that could be considered inappropriate, like you were saying, like being in a hot tub or touching them on their shoulder. I don't know. But that's the sort of thing. That's it.
Right.
And when it comes to receipts or what happened, and then that's just totally ignoring all the adult stuff, right? Like the hostile workplace and the sexual harassment and stuff of the adults.
Right.
So,
and let me just say the child actors who were the girls, it seemed to me that at the time they didn't really understand and were aware of the sexual nature of what they have, of their lines or these, where stuff is squirting in their face and whatever, it seemed that their disgust is as adults looking back. Now, it still is kind of like, all right, that's over the top, but that's like a different thing than feeling like, for instance, about the guy who felt like there was issues with his race and his color. Like he felt that in the moment.
Well, we didn't hear from them in the documentary though, right? They did say that the boys and stuff were laughing at it because they knew what it was. So I'm sure the girls kind of knew what was going on too.
Or that something was weird. Yeah.
We didn't hear from the only one, the big names and stuff, and the people who they were saying had this stuff going on with them was Drake Bell. Right. Mm-hmm. And then we had, they had him in a costume with.
Right. It had these big noses on it.
Stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Supposedly noses.
But it looked like something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you can't just come out and be like, oh, he done this to this person without them actually coming forth. But, they were making claims that these kids had something done to them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Not, all the way, but just inappropriate touching and whatever other situations that they were put in physically with these adults.
Well, and it's like the documentary just said, we're going to take every bad thing that was ever leveled and put it in one bucket and then stir it up so that it makes a big old funky mess. And then we're going to aim the bucket at Dan Schneider and pour the crap on him. Right. And so just full disclosure. So after the documentary came out, Dan Schneider did send out an apology or whatever. And the apology is basically apologizing for the toxic work environment. He did not apologize for, stuff that it sounds like, I don't know if he did or didn't do anything, but his apology was very narrow in terms of like, I'm sorry that I was had to do with this toxic work environment, right?
Yeah.
Because eventually Dan Snyder was pushed out of Nickelodeon and stuff like that, and he tried to get back in, tried to have shows here and there, but that didn't work out for him. So he was eventually pushed out. But what really pushed him out was not these types of toxic work environment things. I don't think what seemed to push him out the most was that he was trying to go and control, once he got out of the kids sector, right? He was trying to control what was happening as Amanda Bynes was becoming more famous. And the level of control that he had been allowed to have over shows that he created or had something to do with was, far greater in those earlier years of success than it was later on. And folks were like, yeah, get him out of here.
But here's a little challenge, right? Without searching by name, go and search and find the name of the first employee at Nickelodeon who was arrested for this sort of things. Mm-hmm. Let me know how long it takes and how many times you see Dan Schneider's name before you even get to the name of someone who was actually arrested for what he done.
Then I also have to we need to loop back and look, everybody who was in the room, parents, writers, anybody who was an adult, if you were a cameraman, if you were just, I don't know, sweeping the floor and you saw stuff go on, of any sort, whether it was the exploitation, whether it was the jokes that were inappropriate, whether it was putting them in the positions inappropriately, whatever it was, you are part of the problem.
Yeah. I say if you're not actually involved in like the writing, the costumes and all of that, right? I say you get 2 good times. You get the first time you're like, oh, something ain't right. And then you get that second time, then there needs to be something that happens that second time.
Right. Something ought to be said. You have to blow the whistle. That's what you should be doing, right, in these situations. But what I feel happened is that when this was going to blow and as people talked more and more, that especially the employees of Nickelodeon who were adults, they said, let me cover my own butt. And they get up there and then they trying to throw these 2 women who were writers on there. Yes, you contributed.
And they talked about how they would have these sexual jokes, how they were laughing at naming a character a certain thing because of, it was a funny sex joke to them. And like, no, it don't work like that.
Yeah. It's just, no.
Yep. So that's the documentary. But I don't think my problem with it is that the whole thing is Schneider, let's talk about how terrible he is. And it just kind of let everyone else go scot-free.
Well, and this is why we always tell you, watch it for yourself. Watch, and then analyze what you're seeing. Like, do you actually see what the implication or the claim was covered in a way that proves things? Because like you said, people talking about, and they came with receipts. Okay, what they came with was the actual court documents. And all of that was mostly limited to either news articles about the actual guy who was one of the predators. And then also the guy who was doing what he was doing to Drake Bell. It wasn't about anything beyond that. So those receipts are not exactly receipts to me because it was clear. Oh, and the other thing I was going to bring up, what about the receipts that they probably mean where people had written letters, right?
Right.
In support of the guy who was convicted, of doing stuff to Drake Bell. Like he had tens of letters of support from very famous people.
Yeah.
In the industry saying, oh, I'm sure that
he didn't have any from Dan Schneider.
No, he didn't. Now, I mean, you could play devil's advocate on that and say Dan Schneider don't want no attention on him.
Nickelodeon
and if
don't
he was
need
doing
that.
something, but at the same time, it's like all these people vouched for him. Now some of them later came back and said they weren't told the full story of what went on with this guy and everything.
The thing is, if I know that's the allegation, I don't know if I even want to be involved. If I don't have intimate knowledge to know that this didn't happen, I'm not going to come out and be like, no, I know this person. They would never know.
Yeah, like I'm not vouching for you on that.
I'm sorry, but I just can't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because if you could simply look at a person and tell, oh, this person is, going to be doing some things, then nobody would ever let these folks around their kids, which brings me to the parents, right? So like the mother who found out, but then, you know, her daughter was still there and everything. And I don't want to, this is a terrible situation. I don't want to indict parents who tried to do what was best for their child. But I think also some of these parents wanted the success a little bit too much. Some of these kids wanted the success a little bit too much, but the adult in the room should be the one to say, okay, this is not
worth
healthy.
it, and
this is not worth it.
When you're an adult, you appreciate it more.
Yeah.
You know, so, but I'm not sure, you know, maybe somebody else knows, but who else came out and apologized besides Dan Schneider?
Well,
for anything?
Probably nobody, right? Because they were essentially pretending as if they didn't do anything. Dan was wrong. Dan. None of them ever were going to suggest that I shouldn't have been writing those things, or I shouldn't have just sat here and let it happen. We did see that type of regret and remorse from the parents who later found out, you know, and I know one of the mothers was like, hey, you know, my child dodged a bullet because, you know, she was being the vocal parent that seemed like she was the problem parent because she didn't like some of the racial type of innuendos that were going on with her son and stuff like that. And she's like, he really dodged a bullet, you know, kind of thing. But, you know, so I don't want to indict them, but to me, that's a huge problem. So go to the comments and let us know if you watched it. When you really think about it, did you see evidence that Dan Schneider did anything other than the stuff with these
inappropriate jokes, right?
Inappropriate jokes and sexual harassment in the workplace, right?
Yeah. Man, of course, there are going to be people where those are signs that he is doing something and maybe they just didn't come forward.
Yeah, maybe they didn't.
Yeah.
You know, but
this doesn't prove anything to me that Dan Schneider did.
Beyond you know, the others. He admitted to the toxic work environment. I think enough people said he was going around asking for massages that I think it's fair to say he was asking for the massages.
Yeah.
Like enough people corroborated that claim. I believe he was going around.
Yeah, I believe he was going around and doing all sorts of stuff to workers and stuff, right? Because, and you know, I am super worker rights advocate, right? You know, and talk about, follow, read up on, research the whole labor movement, right? So yeah, those things were terrible. Which probably happens in most workplaces, the stuff that was going on there, but maybe not to this level. But when it comes to like workers' right, how you're treating your employees, having a toxic work environment is kind of run of the mill.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wouldn't, you know, be Dan Schneider's friend because of the type of person, type of boss that he is, and the creepiness with the kids, right?
Yeah.
But I haven't seen from this documentary anything to the level of a crime per se. Even though something being considered a crime isn't a litmus test for me, it kind of points to how egregious the act is.
And not even just the receipts of anything. None of the child stars said anything, that none of them made an allegation against Dan Schneider about this.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, there's not the there that you're thinking is there with this documentary.
There.
That's the bottom line of it. And I just hate how they conflate all of these different issues and try to put them all together. And then, you know,
I think it would have been much better if it was shorter and they didn't try to point it all to Dan Schneider, right? If you'd like, look at this environment of Nickelodeon in the late 90s in the 2000s, right? Look at what was going on, who they were hiring, what they were doing, the toxic work environment and stuff like that.
Well, and we also have to question the channel that this came out on, right? It came out on the ID channel. And if you know, well, Heit calls the ID channel the death channel if I, you know, was watching some true crime stuff. So like this, they're used to telling true crime type stories. And
yeah, that usually points to one bad, evil person. And that's just typically how you tell stories in Hollywood, right?
Yeah. So I just don't know. I think this is this was also supposed to be good entertainment. But much like the Selena documentary with Selena and Yolanda, where Yolanda Saldivar comes out and supposedly has all these secrets she's about to lay out. And then you watch a bunch of episodes trying to give her a chance, and it just turns out to be a whole big nothing burger. That's how it is. But not with this documentary. It wasn't a nothing burger, but it was some serious misdirection.
So what happened was that, so we had the public record of those arrests, right? So we didn't need a documentary to tell us that. You had people who were on TikTok before this that led to the documentary that was showing us all the creepiness, right, with y'all were making these kids do on the sets of these shows.
Mm-hmm.
So we had that already. So the documentary provided what? I guess we kind of got to hear some of the people involved tell their parts of it, but that's it.
Right. So, you know, all in all, is this a documentary you'd recommend people watch? Docu-series?
Yeah, I recommend it because I was unaware of all of this before this, right? So the people who are on TikTok and stuff probably knew. And you kind of get an idea that they've been doing this in cartoons and stuff. You get all these references. I watched the YouTube videos before where it's showing all these adult jokes in cartoons and stuff, right? And I guess it's a little different when it's actually child actors, right? So now I ain't seen none of this. I didn't watch these shows, these particular ones that they talked about from the late 90s and the 2000s because I was too old at the time. It wasn't any of the shows that I watched. Either. I didn't know any of these people. And yeah, I think if you don't know anything about it, then yeah, go ahead and watch it. It
could be informative. It's just be prepared for like the slow burn because they stretch this out as long as possible. And, you know, I think I will modify my original assessment, which was that it was a waste of time. It was not a waste of time. And you're right. I did learn things that I didn't know. What bothered me was the sheer length of it and that it probably could have been, everything could have been done in an hour. It really could have if they didn't just, you know, drag it out.
Yep. So if you made it this far, type quiet on set so we know you're one of the ones who stick around to the end.
And let us know if you like these docu-series, documentary type reviews. If you haven't checked out our discussion about the Selena and Yolanda, check it out. It'll be linked in the description. And let us know some other stuff that we should be covering and talking about. We also just recently covered the Freaknik documentary, and that'll be in the description as well.